Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad to see you here. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's gathering entitled Talking About Sex, Tech, and Faith with Teens with Dr. Kate Ott. This is our second gathering for this year's YMI Lunch Lab series, and we are so glad to be here. We have people from across the country and even some siblings from other regions of the world joining us today. Thank you for coming, for taking the time, and welcome to this time and space. For our time today, Dr. Ott will speak to us, and then we'll have a brief small group discussion time about halfway through her presentation. We'll conclude by coming back into the larger group for more content sharing and for a final Q&A. We ask that you please remain muted throughout the session, but we'll also be monitoring the chat window. So if you have a question in the meantime, please feel free to type it in there. Our office has a great staff. I'd like to introduce them to you quickly and thank them. The Yale Youth Ministry Institute falls under the purview of the Center for Continuing Ed at YDS. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the managing director of the center, and we're blessed to have Megan Lukens, our communications coordinator. Thank you both for all that you do and more importantly for who you are. If you're new to us, we invite you to peruse the YMI website when you get a chance. That's yaleyouthministryinstitute.org. We'll put that in the chat for you. We have a whole array of resources on there. We have curricula for your youth, training modules for leaders, discussion forums. We have video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry experts. We have anti-racism resources. We have resources for helping youth through mental health challenges. We have mission and outreach endeavors, links to other articles. It's all on there for free. Please do check it out. We also want you to mark your calendars for our upcoming events. Our next offering for this school year will be on Wednesday, November 2nd at 12 p.m., at which time we'll be welcoming Dr. Eric Carter from Vanderbilt. Dr. Carter has unique insight on inclusion for youth who are neurodivergent or who have disabilities. A link to that registration can be found on our website, and we'll put it in the chat as well. Please do join us for that event if you can. We'll then take a break and regather in February with some exciting programming things. So stay tuned for details on that. They will be forthcoming. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Kate Ott. Dr. Ott is a Christian social ethicist addressing the formation of moral communities with specializations in technology, sexuality, youth and young adults, pedagogy, and professional ethics. She's the author of Sex, Tech, and Faith, Christian Ethics in a Digital Age, Christian Ethics for a Digital Society, and Sex Plus Faith, Talking with Your Child from Birth to Adolescence. Dr. Ott is a professor of Christian social ethics and the director of the Stead Center on Ethics and Values at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Her writings appear in various outlets from popular Christian magazines to academic journals, Christian education curricula, full-length books, podcasts, and more. Prior to becoming a professor, Dr. Ott worked in child social services, in church ministry, and at a national faith-based nonprofit organization. Dr. Ott, welcome to this space. We're really honored to have you here.
Thank you so much. I am grateful for this time to be with all of you, for the invitation, also for the familiar faces, well, names more so since your cameras are off, but the familiar names of folks who I see coming into the room today. So as has already been described, I'm going to share a PowerPoint, which I know puts us a little bit passively in this engagement, but I'll turn it on and off as there are times where I have more to say than just the bullet points on the PowerPoint. We will, in the middle of our time, have a short breakout room for conversation. And it is, I just want to be very clear, it's going to be short. It's one of those, like, you know, what you do in youth ministry where you pair and share and you tell them to talk for 5 minutes and come back. So we're going to do that just to get our blood flowing and our ideas moving again. And then we'll come back and finish out with some of the materials after that. So bear with me as I start our PowerPoint. All right. So talking about tech, sex, and faith with teens. I'm going to start our discussion just by letting you know this newest work that I've done is definitely the structure of the text is written for adults. There is a youth study guide at the end of it. You may all have some youth who are ready to read this text, but I would really, the conversation we're having today gives you the foundation of this text. It doesn't give you all the pieces of the text. So if there's other places where you're thinking, oh, I want to have this exact conversation with my young people, like I really want to talk about sexting with them, really need to talk more about like online pornography or virtual reality and online relationships, please check out the text, just because in our time, I thought it was best for us to grab that foundation so that if you choose to use the study guide in some way, it'll be helpful to you. The other piece, I just want to stress what Jill said about the resources of the Youth Ministry Institute. The text itself suggests like 4 or 5 of the curricula that you should go to that are online at the Youth Ministry Institute. So those are foundational. We're going to cover a little bit of that around sexuality education, thinking about our sexual ethics. But those resources are already free and available for you on the Yale Youth Ministry Institute website. So you can find them there. All right, so let's get started. The digital sexuality alters the basics. And I think this for our discussion is probably the most important place for us to start and to really think about what's going on. It alters where we meet, how we define privacy, what counts as me. You know, does my avatar count as me when I'm in a virtual reality space? Who or what is making the decisions in our relationships, in our online connections, and how do we get off? And that is meant to be a double entendre. If you didn't hear it that way, I'll just explicitly say it. So how does it change where we meet? Well, digital technology no longer means that we are bound by geographic time or space walls around how we meet people or who we interact with. Those structures are gone. And so that means that, you know, young people, and I'm sure many of you who perhaps have been through the dating market anywhere in the last 20 years could also attest to the fact that this has changed. People don't meet each other at movies, at the corner store. You know, they don't hang out at the diner and like chat with one another. No, you meet online or through a mediated space where you perhaps are together with your friends, but then the meetings you have after that take place through this networked mediated space, which may be social media or maybe other types of applications. So there is no relationship that your youth will experience that is not digital. And I don't mean that they are meeting random strangers online that are dissembling who they are. That may happen, but that's actually very much the minority. They are having hybrid relationships. The kinds of sexual behaviors they think of don't have the boundaries of whether it's in person or online. It is both. And I think we all, perhaps not as digitally saturated people as our youth are, need to start thinking in the way that that boundary is dissolved. Even our language of online, offline should probably be dissolved. We're just digital all the time. So what does that mean then? How does that change how we define private? Well, I might think, you know, if you're in this room with me physically, this space that's walled in my office, and I share something with you, the boundaries of that space create privacy for us. Most of us go into digital spaces thinking that same thing is going to happen, but it does not. When I share a text message with you, this is not just hearsay where later on you can tell a rumor about what Dr. Out said in her office, but in fact, you have a copy of it. You can copy it, you can remix it, you can share it. So the idea of privacy itself is disrupted. And if you sit down with your youth and ask them about this, they have all kinds of mechanisms they use. Think about that, right? They have very intentional uses of Snapchat versus Instagram versus TikTok, because they understand, for the most part, how many of these spaces have been created and what we would call in technology language, what affordances they have for either creating privacy or not. And yet, most of us still don't have a thorough knowledge of the fact that anything in those digital spaces is saved in some way, creates a data trail of us, and could be accessed. And there's a number of ways, especially around our expressions of sexuality, that I think we need to continue to have conversations about how a surveillance culture of digital technology will affect us now and in the future. And I don't mean that as a scare tactic, please, because youth will tune us out if that's a scare tactic. But if we're thinking about the ways in which privacy is constructed, invite your youth into a conversation about how they navigate that, what do they know about it, and the text itself, Sex, Tech, and Faith, will help you learn some of the digital literacy behind how that functions in our day-to-day use of different forms of technology. It also means, things are duplicated, spread, archived, and many of our youth are already thinking about that. They are curating their identities. And so that goes to our third point: what counts as me? Well, similar to in-person behavior. So I do not want to say that our curation of our online persona is something new. It's not. High school, you got to worry about what clothes you wear, who you sit with, what friend group you're part of. That's just exacerbated online because of this notion of duplication, spreadability, and archiving of the materials, right? Like, oh, thank the Lord that there are not my pictures of like my high school outfits online. I'm very grateful for that, because who I was trying out to be as my person in high school, I'm glad I could leave that behind. And I only have a small group of friends that remember that. But our youth grow up in a world where that photo's there and it's going to be there. And honestly, for the most part, sometimes it's there because their parents are posting them. So please also extend this conversation to the parents that you work with. But how does who I am in the world, how do I understand that as also including my digital footprint? How do I understand whether my engagement online, how is authenticity part of that engagement? How I'm going to show up different in different places, and that's okay, right? I speak differently when I show up as a college professor than when I show up at the coffee shop with my friend. That is not being inauthentic. That is knowing my context and knowing my relationships require something different from me. It's okay to do that online as well. But let's extend that a little bit. If I show up in an online immersive virtual reality where I have created my avatar, what happens if I race myself differently or gender myself differently? Is it still me? How am I interacting with others in that context? There's a good amount of data that demonstrates that if we show up in different gendered and sexual orientation identities online, that has actually increased people's awareness and inclusion of other individuals who have minoritized sexual and gender identities. So there are actual programs that invite people of dominant identities to engage in this online so that they can understand what it feels like to be in a non-dominant identity. So please don't hear me as saying this is wrong to do. It asks us new questions about, from an ethics perspective, right? Who I ought to be or what I ought to do in the world changes if I can literally change my embodiment when I am online. And yet I'm not leaving that embodiment behind. It still counts as me. My body is actually engaged in that immersive experience, and I am feeling, sensing, thinking in my embodiedness through that visual and probably eventually multi-sensory experience as we think about virtual reality. So I really would love us to push back against the idea that we can separate who I am from my moral development offline and online. What we do online morally shapes us, even if I am embodied differently in that space. It's not something I can directly separate. So that also leads to this next point of who or what's making the decisions for us. So yes, we can design our own avatar online. We can decide how we show up or what photos we post, but those are all within certain limited genres, right? These games, they give us a set template that we can use, and that is often informed by the cultural values of wherever that game or that platform has been created. There's a way in which, even the structure of a platform, right? So on Instagram, you have to show up much more visually or audio, right? Language, and Facebook's trying to adopt that now, right? But a while back, Facebook, you could actually just post text and that was okay. In what ways does the software have built-in values that it is pushing us to make decisions about? Or where is it limiting our choices? And that's another aspect of conversations we need to be having, because how do we disrupt that, perhaps, when those values do not align with ours? And so a significant place for this is also where we would think about the use of algorithms on these social media platforms. And honestly, algorithms in basically any digital experience you're having, right? Do you really need to keep watching that next show on Netflix just because it said play next episode and you don't have to click anything? Probably not. You should make your own decision. But the tech makes it for you. Right? I mean, sometimes, go ahead, binge. But all the time, no. So these are behavioral systems built into our digital technology that are shaping how we interact with one another. And too often, we just adopt the ecosystem without questioning how the ecosystem has been set up or why. I think an absolutely, probably the most fascinating conversation I have had recently is a conversation with young adults, female identified folks, about their strategies on Instagram. They know how the ecosystem is set up. They know how to post, what to post, how to pose, when, right? They have thought through this. And in that conversation, they have thought through how to negotiate with the platform. But what they didn't think about was, why does the platform want that from you? And that's the question that I want to engage youth in, because that shapes how we show up with our sexuality, our gender. And if we don't, before that step, say, what do I want from it? Then it's only a negotiation. I'm not bringing anything to that table with my firm set of values beforehand. I'm only being responsive. So part of what we're going to talk about today is how to start from that point of naming my values and then bringing them to these questions of where we meet, how we define privacy, what counts as me, and who or what's making the decisions. How do I get involved in that? And then lastly, how do we get off? So the sex tech industry is one of the most lucrative industries when it comes to technology. After Google and Amazon, one of the most searched sites is Pornhub. So if any of you here are thinking, oh, my youth don't do anything related to sex and technology, I just want to tell you right now, the data suggests otherwise. Whether they find it, their friends find it, whether it finds them, all youth have had some sort of interaction with some version of what we would call sex tech. That might be online pornography, that might be self-made pornography, that might be in video games and different kinds of sexual behaviors that are in back-end versions of certain video games. It might just be meetup apps. It might be how they have their relationships and form those relationships online. It's out there, it's happening, and that's why we need to have this conversation. It also means that the technology itself is starting to shape our sexuality. And that's what I mean by how we get off. So lots of the behavioral, the who or what decisions get made, right? The behavioral tech that's built into our devices is affecting how we think and respond affectively to those cues. So a very simple one that many of us know is when you get the little light that says either you have a text message or someone liked something on your social media, or right, that little light on your phone, or the little pop-up that says you have this message, we feel compelled to click on. We feel compelled to click on it because we have gotten affirmation from that. The tech companies have learned that our dopamine levels go up if we interact with this, if we feel connected, if we feel affirmed. Those are all good things. Feeling connected, feeling affirmed. But for what? For what reason? For what outcome? And that's the next step that we have to be thinking about as we have these conversations with our youth. Towards the end of this, I'm going to use online pornography as our primary example of how to have a conversation around sex tech with youth. And a couple of the things you'll hear me talk about relate specifically to these aspects of digital sexuality, but directly related to online pornography. And there's a way in which the use of digital technology around online sexually explicit materials sets up a whole new performance standard of the kinds of bodies people should have, because they're digitized, they're not real, or they're reshaped in ways that we can't even physically do that to our bodies. But also the ways in which certain activities loop and engage us in those dopamine level responses that we can't get offline. We actually have to restructure ourselves to say, actually, these are my pleasures offline versus my pleasures online. And for young folks, you know, who oftentimes are hiding these kinds of activities or feel shame about them because we haven't talked about them, because we don't say, hey, your sexuality is good, it's okay to experience sexual pleasure and let's talk about it. They're not getting anyone who's having this kind of conversation with them. So that is really our hope for today, is to change that. That's my hope, to think about how that will happen. In order to do that, we're going to have to rethink a little bit about what we think about Christian digital sexual ethics and how we talk about it with teens. Many of you might already be here. You might already be like, yes, of course we need to do that. And some of you might be thinking, no, actually what we need to do is just dig in even further and be really explicit, you know, about the kinds of ways we talk about sexuality and the way that teens should not be expressing their sexuality. I want to say first that oftentimes our gut reactions of harm that can come for teens related to sexuality, it's real. And I don't want to put any teens in harm's way when it comes to their sexuality. But the truth is, not talking about sexuality, not giving teens a space to talk about their own sexuality and their sexual relationships is already harming them because they are having these experiences. And creating an open space, a non-judgmental space for conversation, is a practice of doing no harm. It's giving them a space for these conversations. It's letting them think about, what do they expect from a sexual relationship? What's expected of other people, right? At its most basic level, a conversation about digital Christian sexual ethics is, who am I supposed to be and what do I want to do in this digital world as I think about my sexuality? It also means we have to think about sexuality as much more than behavior. Every one of us is a sexual being from birth till death. It doesn't mean we are always engaging in sexual behaviors. It means our sexuality is so much more than those behaviors. It's more than our gender identity and our sexual orientation. It's how we understand intimacy, how we experience sensuality. It's about our sexual and reproductive health. It's far more robust. And this is where I want to give the plug, right? The Youth Ministry Institute actually has a youth study on how we think about sexuality. We have a whole set of videos on on this robust understanding and definition of sexuality so that we don't limit our conversations around sexuality only to what behaviors are youth engaging or not engaging. Also, if we truly switch to this understanding that we are sexual beings from birth till death, there is no right time to have this talk, and there is no one time to have this talk. It is who we are, and it is something that we can incorporate and talk about across our ministry. So what I want us to switch to as our sort of approach is, how do we think about who we should be as sexually healthy, aware, embodied, and relational people in this digital context in which we live? Now that's a switch, because many of us have been handed a rule-based way to talk about sexual ethics with young people. We have been handed this Christian tradition that says, actually, sexual ethics is just about behaviors. There's a list, some of them are right, and some of them are wrong. And you know what? Because we just don't want teens to do this, we're just going to tell them it's all wrong until a certain point, right? So we have this history of sexual ethics that says only procreative sexual intercourse is good. And some of us come from traditions for which that is still the dominant doctrine. If that is true for you and that is still your dominant doctrine, what else are you saying to young people about sensuality, about loving their bodies, about how they express intimacy with other people that does not include sexual behaviors? That's still part of their sexuality. For those of you who don't come from a tradition where this is still the dominant norm, stop saying this to people. Like, don't let it be your default for youth ministry anymore if it's not actually the doctrine of your church. I don't know why we teach teens this and then we expect them to like miraculously change their ethic when they become adults. Let's give them a good ethic from the start, and what I think is a much higher standard, much more difficult to live into. So one of the ways we do this is we say, okay, well, actually that whole procreative thing that we got handed down from Augustine, that's not the majority of mainline Protestant traditions anymore for the most part. So instead, in those traditions, we're going to say, actually, there's a relationship that's right or wrong. And, you know, we kind of hope in our conversations with teens that that's going to look like some version of marriage or long-term partnership. And so we say, yes, sexuality is great. Sexual pleasure is good. Please do it in this and only this relationship. But then we don't say anything about the work that it takes to have that relationship. The magic of a ring and a big party does not create a sexually healthy relationship. I mean, I have a mentor who used to say to me that when she read her children the fairy tale stories, and it would say like, they lived happily ever after, she would always change it to say, they lived happily ever after, and it took a lot of work. Right? We know that about all of our relationships. So if in your tradition, the dominant sexual ethic is that sexual behaviors should happen only within a marital relationship, then please also spend time with your young people on what a sexually healthy relationship in a marriage looks like. What kind of work does it take to achieve that? What kinds of things do you need to know about communication style, about your own sexuality, about sexual health before you get into that relationship in order for it to be one that would be sexually healthy? So again, none of these ethics lead us to not talking about sexuality and sexual health prior to these relationships or these behaviors happening. In fact, we don't want it to be a history lesson. We want to talk about it ahead of time. Now, I want to suggest that these are okay doctrines to have if you have them in your traditions. I want to push our youth to something more difficult as a sexual ethic that I think is not counter to these. You could use it along with this if it is part of your tradition. I think we need a rules-based sexual, not rules. We don't need a rules-based, we need a value-based sexual ethic. What does that mean? That means that as we think about what we embrace in terms of sexual ethics and relationships is about how we live out our values. And I can't give you a list of right and wrong for digital technology when it comes to that, because it is developing too quickly. If I say this form of sexting is always morally wrong, there's going to be a new way to do it. There's going to be a new platform. There's going to be a different way to contain privacy, share about our bodies in the next 2 weeks. That rule list isn't going to work in a technological culture that is altered so rapidly. So let's help our youth become ethicists. I mean, this is my goal in life for everyone, but let's really help our youth become thoughtful ethicists about their lives, use their moral imagination. And you know what? Fail sometimes. We're not all going to have great relationships. Not all sexual behaviors are going to be pleasurable. We're going to fail. We got to practice at this. And whether that scares us or not, that's what youth are already doing. So how about we insert the expectation of moral discernment into that process and a place for them to talk about those experiences. So what is this sort of higher level value? I want our youth to come up with it, and I think they can do that. I think if we provide a scriptural basis for them and we invite them into developing their own sexual ethic, many of them also have some version of this in their heads already, in the way they've talked with their friends about it. They've talked through their failures. They've said, oh man, that wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Like, what should I do differently next time? Right? They've talked about what they want in a relationship. So how do we help them think about a values-based sexual ethic? Here are some that I often start with. Honesty, mutuality, pleasure, consent, generativity, commitment, and trust. And I'm gonna talk for a couple more minutes, but I want to let you know that we're gonna go into breakout groups soon. And I'm gonna ask you to have this conversation in those breakout rooms. So where do I get these values from? I get these values from doing a sexual ethics exercise with teens all over North America, having read 1 Corinthians. You go to those weddings, you hear love is not. Yeah, Paul wasn't talking to lovers. Paul was talking to a church community or a newly forming Christian community who couldn't get along with one another. So one of the things I want youth to understand is a relationship is a relationship, whether it's online or offline. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the way a community can't get along, or we're talking about the way two people who are in a sexual relationship can't get along. Our core values are what guide the way we form relationships, whether that's in community or whether that's individually. So what are the values that we want to guide the way in which we form any relationship, but especially our sexual relationships? My experience in doing this with teens across North America, by the way, this exercise is also on the Youth Ministry Institute site. I believe it's called Creating Your Sexual Ethic. I'm not sure. I'll look it up. We can put it in the chat. You can do this exercise with your teen. What is their sexual ethic? What are the values that are most important to them? I want to say a young man, I think he was maybe 15 one time, sort of tentatively raised his hand as we were doing this exercise. And he said, can I put growth on there? Is growth a value? And I was like, yes. Like, I kind of thought that's what I meant by generativity, but not really. And how insightful is that, right? Our relationships change over time. We change. So what if growth was a core value to how we form relationships? So I also, when I create this list of values with young people and I ask them to pick their top 5 and commit to those top 5, how are they going to always look for those values? How are they going to work towards those values in any relationship they have, especially their sexual relationship? At the end of that conversation, I ask them, Do you think that's more difficult? If I say, like, you have to have these things in order for this to be a sexually healthy relationship where you're going to engage in sexual behaviors with someone, do you think that's more difficult than me saying, like, sexual behavior should always be procreative, or like, got to be long term? All of them feel like I've done a bait and switch on them. They're like, we thought you were going to come and tell us it's okay to engage in sexual behaviors, and now you've told us we have to do all this work ahead of time as part of our relationship. Yeah. And right, what if those marriages, what if those long-term relationships that we talk about in our faith communities, what if they looked like this? What if they were honest, mutual, pleasurable, consensual, generative, committed, and full of trust? Right? I think that's what we want for all of our relationships. So for you to do that work before we delve into what this looks like specifically when we're talking about it in the digital context, I would love us, we're going to go into some breakout rooms and talk about what would be your list. What are the values that are the foundation for how you talk about sexual ethics, or how you live your own sexual ethic in the world, so that you've already got that language ready to go when you have this conversation with youth in your context. We'll give you 5 minutes because this is one of those parent shares. Just brainstorm quickly, come up with some of those ideas. There is a link in the chat that goes to this slide in case you didn't write this down quickly. You'll have that link. So click on that before you go into your breakout rooms. You lose the chat when you go into those rooms. But head into those rooms, talk about what are the values that come to mind for you. I also want to say it might be something like scripture. Maybe the love commandment comes to mind for you. What I want to push you to say then is, as you think about the love commandment, what values need to be lived out in order for you to say, oh, that relationship is living the love commandment. So if there are scripture pieces that come to mind for you, ask yourself that next question. What are the values that embody the living out of that scripture for you? All right, let's take a quick breakout room, 5 minutes. All right, so values, put them in the chat. What were some values that you came up with, or scripture that was guiding that you then named some values out of? I apologize if everyone in the group didn't get to share. This will give us additional conversation once we make it through this next piece of it. All right, partnership, I see one. Brittany, honesty, authenticity, openness, excellent. I want to say the link was put in there, I hope, creating your sexual ethic. So please go and check that out in terms of how you might do this activity with your youth, and the way in which that might set a foundation for then further conversations if you jump into these digital specific issues. So excellent. So I hope those of you who weren't in these groups, right, look at the list, see what's out there. And it's also great to have a list like this if the conversation around what are some values you would add to the Corinthians passage. I start with that because it sets a list of sort of good values and bad values. And then the youth can kind of jump off from there. We go back to the PowerPoint for us. Excellent. Oh my gosh, these are great. I'm going to have to capture the chat so that I can also have some of these new values that I hadn't thought of for my own exercise doing this. All right. So let's go back now. Okay, now we have that foundation. We have a little bit different way of approaching how we're going to talk about a sexual ethic. And the level we're going to ask the youth to rise to, and maybe all of our adults as well, right? Rise to this level and say, actually, it's not just a list of do's and don'ts that make someone a sexually healthy or sexually, moral, upstanding, good person. Or it's not just that's how you get a healthy relationship because you check a box. Instead, these are values. These are actions we have to live out every day that we make choices about. Now, how do we apply that as we think about how the digital sexuality alters the basics? So how do I live out honesty in a way in which digital technology defines privacy differently? How do I think about trust and mutuality when, we're only meeting online and I don't know if that's really you texting me the message or your friend took your phone to text it, right? How do I start to think about the complexity of living out those values where some of the ways, the concrete ways in which we are together have radically shifted? So I'm going to walk us through, I'm going to call this an ethics of praxis, right? Those of you, you got to throw in some seminary words once in a while, right? Educational words. So praxis, the active, reflective exercise of thinking about our moral lives. To me, that's the definition of ethics, right? It's this second order. I step back and I say, what happened in that circumstance? How did context affect it? How do I think about the way I acted or I was in that space? And what did I hope to gain from there? That's making people ethicists. So let's do that with our youth. Let's give them the space to do that. And I'm going to walk us through maybe how we might do that as we think about online pornography. So one of the first things we need to do in applying what we know thus far is be more sexually and digitally literate. Right? The ways in which I've talked about how digital technology shapes our reactions and behaviors, we need to know that ahead of time. We need to know that, for example, online pornography, the way in which it is created to loop and constantly show us quick action kind of behaviors is training us to think about sexual excitement in that way. So that's being digitally and sexually literate about that material. So there's a lot on this page. I apologize for the messiness of it, but I lost my ability to say, oh no, we don't need all of it. We need all of it. So let me just say a bit about these pieces, because I think we do have a lot of myths about the way in which we think about pornography or online sexually explicit material. And the first myth we have is that somehow it's always all bad. And in fact, erotic material does not deform people's sexuality or sense of sexual desire. There are many, many, many people who use online sexually explicit material, and it is beneficial to them. The research studies show that they use it for pleasure, stress relief, education, and relationship enhancement. And those are all potentially good things for our own sexuality, for our lives, our relationships. That is what the majority of people do use sexually online sexually explicit materials for. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who have negative effects using online sexually explicit material. And here you're going to hear, I'm switching my language a bit, which I'll talk about in a moment, from pornography to online sexually explicit material, because it's not all the same. There are some people who have very specific pre-identifying factors that predispose them to compulsive behaviors. It's not just online material, right? They are predisposed to compulsive behaviors around a variety of issues, but the way the tech is created, it actually feeds into that in a way in which it makes it more difficult for folks to resist the way the tech is built. The other important thing to think about here is that it's not the tech that's causing this, right? So that's where we would talk about the difference between cause and correlation. It correlates with these other predisposed factors, and it exacerbates them. This group of folks demographically, young men, mostly young white men, and that has a lot to do with accessibility to these resources and accessibility to digital technology. Predominantly heterosexual, and also young men who tend to have difficulty in terms of communication, and that's not just in sexual relationships, like communication generally with other people. So those are a variety of the factors. They also tend to have lower self-esteem and lower body image. So you put that configuration of pre-identified factors together, and then you put that young person going online, viewing online sexually explicit material, oftentimes choosing pornography, which is a very specific type of content of online sexually explicit material that is often, leaves out any form of relationship, of communication that's focused primarily on behavior, oftentimes shows, racist, sexist, heterosexist types of imagery, like that's its predominant thing it's marketing. Those two together, you correlate the predisposition to compulsive behaviors and all these other factors that this young person has with the use of online pornography that has these other factors, and it can lead to compulsive pornography use. Again, I just want to stress that that is a small subset of folks. It is a subset of folks that are in your ministry and you should be speaking to, but please don't talk about pornography or online sexually explicit material as though that is the way everyone uses it, or that is the way that everyone experiences, because that is not true. For more information on this, you can read the whole chapter on pornography and on self-made pornography. But I want to stress that as we think about this. I also want to say, for everyone, our access to online sexually explicit material and pornography has radically changed. I'm old enough where there was no, pornography online when I was a young person. I don't think, the internet was just forming. So it was some of the first content to come online, but I didn't have access to it. You had to secretly find a magazine from someone's friend, or, maybe someone had an HBO subscription or something, right? It's just ubiquitous. You don't have to try hard to find online pornography these days. You can view it privately, and the range of content is explosive, from extremely violent pornography and child sexual abuse types of things, all the way to very sexually healthy content that is used by sexuality educators and for folks who need it in terms of relationship enhancement. So our notions of privacy, of access, and of content have radically changed with the way it's been digitized. And then this last piece, I want to say there's a subset of pornography that we should talk about as self-made. So I would put sexting in this category, when a young person takes a picture of themselves and sends it to someone they like, or they want to get them to like them by sending the photo, right? That is self-made pornography. And we need to be educated about the ways in which law enforcement, schools, jobs handle that if it's found out. I will say, even with all of that information at play, young people are still going to sext one another. It is a sexual behavior in a digital age. And it's something that we need to be fluent at talking about, both from a sexual literacy and a digital literacy perspective. And there are definitely ways that young people use it to enhance their relationships. It is not always a negative aspect. The other thing about the democratization of pornography online is that many of the people who used to be actors or actors within online pornography have become the producers of it. They have their own channels, they control it, and that has had a significant pushback on the kind of limitations of traditional heterosexist and racist pornographic imagery online. So one can find pornography that really fits a more positive and healthy kind of expression across gender identities, races, and sexual orientations. Okay, so that's some sexual literacy, some digital literacy. We've raised the level of how we think about how this functions online. Let's think about how we might bring sexual theology to this conversation when we're talking with young people. When I talk about online pornography or self-made pornography, I always start with, we're created by God and made in God's image. That means bodies are good. That means our sexuality is good. But we don't just have bodies. They're not something we consume about other people. We are our bodies. In all their wholeness, messiness, complexity. That means that we can't disassociate a person, who someone is, who God created them to be, from their body that we want to just consume. So this theological message shifts our understanding of sexuality to a much more positive, embodied sense of who we are,
while also pushing against a consumerist approach to bodies and beauty. As we also think about the ways in which our bodies and our sexuality are created by God, they are created to be, sexual attraction is not, from my point of view, is not something that came with the fall, right? Adam and Eve looked at each other and wanted to partner before the fall. Sexual desire and pleasure. Chris Gudorf, who's a Roman Catholic theologian, moral theologian, ethicist, writes about the fact that if our bodies were in fact created by God, this is just a little sexual literacy as well, right? And female embodied folks in terms of their sex were created with a clitoris as part of their genitalia. There is zero other reason for that body part but sexual pleasure. So if God created us that way, God had in mind that sexual pleasure was supposed to be part of who we are and how we experience the world. Now, for some people who identify as asexual, their bodies don't respond that way, and that is a small subset of folks. But what I want to try to set up for young people is to say, how do we understand sexual attraction and sexual pleasure as something that takes in the wholeness of God's creation, but doesn't lead us to want to use or abuse other people? So we can affirm sexual attraction and pleasure while also saying it is morally wrong to use or abuse other people. And that's this last part. As embodied people, we are to be valued and respected as part of God's good creation. And that sets up the limit. If I'm looking at material that is abusing people non-consensually, right, that's harming people, then I have crossed over that line. I am no longer valuing the beauty of God's creation. I am no longer respecting God's creation. I am into the realm of abuse and harm. All right. So how do we put this to use then as we have this conversation? This is the part that I think can be most difficult for us. It's often most difficult for me, especially as an ethicist, because I want to quickly get to, okay, here's what's right and wrong. And I want us to resist that, especially in conversations on digital technology and talking with young people. I want us to start with questions. I want them to practice doing ethics. Let's have them be the ethicists in our conversations and in our groups. So have a conversation. How do you identify the difference between using sexually explicit material for education or for consuming it as popular media, right? Where would they set those lines? How do they think about that? Maybe think about people's comments on a posted video or a photo. How do you know when someone's honoring another person's body or objectifying it? They clearly know the difference, and they will tell you what kind of comments lead to it or don't. How would we respond to one another? How do we respond to our friends if their comment is objectifying as opposed to honoring? How do we start practices that push back against that? In what ways does learning about your body or sexuality deepen your relationship with self, partner, and God? And how could you do that using sexually explicit online material, right? There is a good amount of research that demonstrates that young LGBTQ youth go online looking for sexually explicit material because they do not see themselves or the kinds of desires they have reflected in the communities they are part of. And they have basic questions like, what does it look like to kiss another boy? How do I express the way my body looks when I know it doesn't fit the norm? Right? When they're not having those conversations with adults, they go online looking for the answers. And that's okay. Why not pair that with the conversations with adults? Why not give them safe places to go online to look for this material? And I give a couple of those in the book, Sexuality Education Resources, where you can find those kinds of sites and where they'll direct you to safer material that fits kind of the values that I've already expressed here. And then, of course, what values are guiding the young people's response, right? If you've done this values-based exercise with them and they have those values, how might you say, okay, you see this online. Tell me, is it honest? Does it include mutuality? Is it pleasurable? Why? Is it pleasurable because you're consuming? Is it pleasurable because you're honoring? How do you actually put that into practice when you're thinking about the use of these materials? And invite them to be a digital ethicist, right? A digital sexual ethicist. I have an activity where I ask young people to create an app that displays. So if you were to either, like, before you're going to send a sex to like self-made pornography, or you're going to log in and look at online pornography, like, I want there to be this pop-up that you have to think about ahead of time. And like, maybe ask yourself some questions. Does this lead to honoring God's creation? Do I find this, is this educational and helping me understand my sexuality? I don't know. The young people usually come up with the better questions and ideas for how this app would be created. But I want them not to just assess the way the technology is done, but I want them to think about themselves as creators, as designers, as people who could speak back to the tech industry and say, this is actually what I want. There's a woman who is in London, I'm sorry, her name is escaping me right now, who created a website called Make Love, Not Porn. And she was in the pornography industry for years and decided that actually digital technology allowed her to create a completely different space that put forward the values she felt needed to be part of how we understand sexuality and use of online sexually explicit material. So it's also, anyway, she has all these economic values that go into it in terms of pay structure, in addition to thinking about the ways in which types of online material have to be engaged in real people's lives. So you can't, for example, share a video on that site that that's been digitally edited in ways that, aren't humanly possible to do certain behaviors. It actually has to be all real. And in that sense, it really pushes back against this online pornography industry. And I think she's a good secular example of what it would look like to take these values and say, I'm going to create something different about it. I'm going to push back on the technology to live differently. So what is it that I hope at the end of doing these kinds of conversations with young people and engaging them in raising their sexual digital literacy, in thinking about sexual theology and ethics in a new way, and practicing those Christian sexual ethics exercises to get us to maybe question that when, we're not in youth group, but we're off on our own in a relationship with someone, trying to think through what this looks like, whether I say yes or no, or what I hope for in this relationship. I hope that we leave our young people with an embodied and inclusive theological approach to sexual ethics that raises the standard of what we hope for in terms of sexually healthy and Christian relationships, that they're a little bit more digitally and sexually literate in terms of their ethical responses. And that lastly, we've created a space where they feel comfortable sharing in moral discernment rather than creating spaces of silence and fear when it comes to sexuality and digital technology. So thank you all. I will stop sharing this now. And I think we have time for more conversation and questions.
Dr. Ott, thank you so much. This is really rich, interesting, provocative, in the best possible ways stuff. So thank you for that. We've gotten a couple of questions throughout the presentation, a few emails and such. If anyone has other questions, please drop them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourselves and ask the question directly. The first one that came up is something that came up when I was in a small group with Jenny, and I'm gonna call you out, Jenny, because you said it was okay to do that. But yeah, Jenny had a question about helping the youth create these values.
Just basic, like how to do it?
More specific. Yeah, Jenny.
Oh, Jenny, you gonna jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I was saying that, this made me think immediately of love your neighbor as yourself. And part of your value, the value structure, are things that I think most of our teens, if they had the opportunity, would say a lot of these words. The problem is they don't feel them internally. Like they don't. So when they are with a partner or they date someone or have a relationship online, the problem is that these behaviors don't come out because they don't feel them in their own self. So where does that part happen? Like, how do we work with them in this way to bring this forward, but also help them know that they can't feel this intrinsically? They're not going to get that from a partner. They're going to find people who don't treat them in those ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, one, I think just saying that out loud like demystifies it. And even saying like, that's true about adult relationships, living in a partnered relationship for over 25 years now, I still have those moments where I'm like, okay, gotta be honest about this thing. It's been eating away at me. It's a new thing, but by the way, let's work on it. So for me, it's a couple of things that I think we need to cultivate. The very first one is communication skills. I think we do not spend enough time with youth and young people actually practicing our communication skills with one another. And one of the ways I do this when I come into a youth group context is we don't just name these values. We get up and you have to talk to a different person every 3 minutes or something. Give me an example, define honesty for me. Give me an example of when you felt honesty happened and when you felt honesty didn't happen in a concrete lived experience. All right, so we're getting all these examples out of when it happens and when it doesn't happen. And y'all are with these people for many more hours in a year than I am. You can then say, okay, we're going to spend some time on like, what gets in the way of honesty, right? I don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. I don't want them to dump me, right? Because we live in this world where we think if we get dumped, we will never find anyone else. And we live in a world where we think you should just get over it. Early on, about 15 years ago now, maybe more than that, because COVID screws up my dates, maybe 20 years ago, Columbia University did some research on brain chemistry, and it was shown that when people experience a breakup where they felt what they describe as love or, that like ultimate connection, that their brain chemistry looks the same as someone detoxing from drugs. So when we say to a young person, like, that really wasn't love, you're like 15, get over it. They might literally be dealing with the same level of someone trying to detox from an addiction in terms of how their body is responding to this loss. So let's take it seriously and the risks of being honest when that might lead to breaking up. The other piece of this that I think is intuitive to our own experiences, but comes out all the time when I'm working with youth, is that our friends are a much better judge of whether the core values we have are showing up in our relationship than we are. And so I often have youth groups. I have people, and I think a couple of people are on this call who have done this with me. Brittany Porch is one of them, where we ask kids to act out a relationship on a talk show, and then the other youth give them advice. And I have literally been in youth groups where someone has turned to someone else and said, like, quietly, I said that same thing to you last week, and you told me I was dumb, right? So it's creating a community of people who hold each other accountable to those values. And that's my definition of Christian community. And so how do we cultivate that in a way where, this is commonplace for how we talk about things and how we hold each other accountable? Those would be two things I would name. I'm sure all of you have others intuitively that could be part of this conversation and how we live it out. But the other thing I just want to really keep honing in on is my fancy word of praxis. This takes practice. Let's just keep telling everyone it takes practice. I don't know where the myth came from that somehow we're supposed to be good at sexuality and good at sexual relationships from some innate thing. We're not. we're awful at it. So let's practice it together.
Thank you so much for that. We got another question from somebody who's asking, do you have any tips on what to do when teens are coming to you with questions or guidance or sharing situations they are in that trust is there, but their parents or guardians don't want you to talk about this? The person writes, I'm a firm believer that the more open we are about topics like sex and sexuality, the better prepared our youth will be. But some of my parents are in the, if we don't talk about it, they won't do it mindsets.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's often the most difficult position to be in. And it's one of the reasons I'm grateful to be able to like pilot into a group and say whatever I want. And then people can get mad at me when I leave. So that is one strategy, right? Bring other people in as like experts to share that information. The other thing I would say is parent education is just as important as everything we've talked about today, especially when you're dealing with a group of parents who are not, they're not digitally immersed as their young people are. We do also now live in a context where facts are often disputed, but I think for the most part, when you're talking with many parent groups, anytime you can bring in like, no, actually, here's this research study, or, the town that I live in, our Women and Family Center does a youth survey, which I know is unique, does a youth asset survey every, I think, 2 or 3 years. It's a really important tool for us to be able to say, look, here's what's going on in the town, right? Here's our level of kids who are engaged in this kind of drug use, this kind of sexual behaviors. Here's how our youth identify. Like, this is just the picture of our community. And if this is the picture of our community, how can we start talking about these conversations? So if you have something like that, you can always use national data, but it's not as good to convince parents why you should talk about it in your local context. So parent education, maybe a better demographic understanding of what the youth are struggling with and how they're struggling with it. And then bringing in experts. And the fourth thing that comes to mind for me that I know has often been helpful is to provide a variety of ways to get this information. So partner with what else is going on. If this young person feels that you are a safe person for information to talk about it, if you feel compromised because of leadership wise, or that you shouldn't be talking about it, parents don't want you to, you can also be someone who provides resources. And I know that might still get you in trouble, but it's less trouble than you directly sharing that information in some context. And I would do that publicly, right? Does your bulletin board or digital bulletin board that you have for your youth have those resources on it? If not, it should. And how can you share that so that it's for everyone and it's not just targeting certain folks in the group?
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Can I also just say, Jill,
Please.
really quickly, all of you have a wealth of resources and information. So if you have other ideas as I'm answering these questions, put them in the chat, like things you have done that have been successful. We're always a genius together, not individually. So go ahead. Sorry, Jill.
No, that's great. Yeah, we learn more when we collaborate on those things. No question about it. Let's talk about children. So you mentioned that we're sexual beings from birth until death. And you also said that there's no right time to have this talk and there's no one time to have this talk, which I think is exactly right from my experience. And we at YMI tend to believe that children's ministry flows into youth ministry, and seeing it as a flow is really important. So how might we talk to kids about this?
So I think changing our approach to that robust understanding and definition of sexuality is really important. Because I think when we say, oh, how should we talk about sexuality with children? We immediately are like, either we're talking about sexual abuse, or, oh my gosh, I don't want to talk to them about people having intercourse, which honestly, they're like scientists. If you tell them how people have sexual intercourse, they're like, ew, great. Don't talk about it anymore. It's factual, biological. It's good to share. It does not harm them. They're not scarred for life. They don't go out and try it. All the data and research shows that. But let's expand beyond that. If sexuality is about intimacy, about sensuality, about health, about taking care of our bodies, about how we form relationships and share in intimacy and sensuality. That happens in friendships. It happens in parent-child relationships. It happens all the time, right? Just even talking about, how does a hug make you feel? When is it okay to have a hug? How should people ask you if you want or need a hug, but you shouldn't be forced to give a hug? Like, those are all really early messages about consent, about autonomy and body ownership, about expressing ourselves and our embodiment and our sexuality in healthy ways. You can have that conversation with a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, right? The conversation with, elementary school kids that, I don't know if anyone else has ever had this experience in their own life or with their own children, but like, you have a best friend, and then that best friend in 2nd grade plays with someone else, and they are no longer your friend and your world has ended. We're going to deal with that the rest of our lives. How do we have multiple relationships where we can express love and friendship without them having to be singular or ultimate? If you can figure out how to do that in 2nd grade, before you figure out how to do that in 8th grade, you're going to have a much better and healthier set of friends and sexual relationships. So see if I can see it. The Sex Plus Faith book does break this down by each age group from 0 all the way through high school. It also adds in what our theological messages and values conversations might be around that. Also, those of you in United Church of Christ or Unitarian Universalist, those of you not in those traditions, go check out Our Whole Lives. It offers great curricular resources from kindergarten all the way to older adults for this kind of material and lessons. So.
That's great. Thank you. As a parent of a 2nd grader, I have those conversations all the time. So yeah, it's a good reminder. Let's talk about sexting for a second. So you mentioned that this is normative behavior, and that's not really a value judgment. It's just a fact that this is something that's reality. So I heard it that way. I'm sure, though, that sexting can sometimes lead youth into areas that are unhealthy from an ethical perspective. So how do we help youth draw that line for themselves? Is it, I love the idea of helping them create their own value system for this, and that sounds perfectly right to me. As we all know, sometimes there's an impulsivity to some of these things that supersedes the values that we create. So any wisdom on that?
So the first is that I firmly, and this is like a long tradition in queer theology and queer theory, is that actually around sexuality issues, we probably learn more about who we are and how to be in the world from our failure than we do from our successes. I do recognize that some experiences of sexting could and have, because of the kinds of ways in which we've heard about these stories, have led to teen suicide or teen suicide attempts, or kind of groups exploiting this material, young men kind of collecting all of these images of young women. So please don't hear me say like, well, that failure we should learn from. No, I'm talking about more of our everyday kind of relationships where, we think, oh, I'm going to send that image and no one else will see it, but then 5 other friends see it or something like that. There's been research out of the UK with young teenage women, a diversity of racial, ethnic, and class backgrounds, who have started to, because they recognize that sexting in heterosexual relationships is a really gendered exercise. And so they've started to curate certain photos or messages with each other, and they share them among their group so that everyone knows about them. So that if they send it and it does get out to a wider public, they've already got a group of support for it. Now, I would say that that's an ethical approach to what we might call like burdened virtues or the lesser of two evils, right? We're dealing with a system that's set up against those folks. And so how do they negotiate that system in a way that they can add some safeguards and also benefit themselves? So my first reaction to this is, let's look at what's already happening. Let's have some sense of how youth are being savvy and trying to play with the technology and how they understand relationships and support as part of it. So that's like the digital sexual literacy. Let's let's understand that a little bit first before we make some judgments about it. In the one-on-one kind of relationships, let's recognize, again, this takes practice. There's failure. That's part of it. And then I really do think at the end of that chapter in the book, I give a couple of concrete questions of like, how would I ask myself these things? Is this going to further my relationship? Will it make my relationship better? Not just will the person stick around? Do I feel comfortable sharing this image of myself? Like, am I proud of it? And you know what? Some young people are. And if you as an adult don't think it's a great idea, like, I'm going to err on the side of them having pride in their body and their image, and having used that. So I do give some concrete questions that we might ask more explicitly about the technology and about should I or shouldn't I? But I also think in the end, again, I can't imagine all the circumstances in which this would happen, that my only approach is to say, how do I both bring my values to it in the decision making and give myself grace when I don't live them out?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It really seems to come back to understanding where your own values lie, right? And where your own limits are. And is this a furtherance of a positive thing that is associated with those decisions that you've made prior to being in the moment? Yeah.
And I do really want to add that community aspect. Like, I love that this research showed that these young women were like collectively creating this library for themselves, that they could publicly be like, no, we're proud of this. So yeah, I mean, let's make it normative that like before you sent a text or something, you would reach out to some friends and be like, what do y'all think?
Yep. Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left, probably enough time for one other question. So question came in, how do you get a group of youth to talk about this stuff? So I'm thinking back to my own experience. I've had some very savvy youth who would engage in this readily. And I've also had some youth who were not there developmentally, in terms of relationships, whatever. So assuming a diverse group of youth, how do you begin to go about this kind of conversation? What's a good starter?
So again, I hate to be harping on this, like the Youth Ministry Institute has resources up there. I promise you did not tell me to say that. But those resources are up there. There are great resources out there to lead these conversations. And I think some of the qualities of those resources that allow for this kind of, I would be careful. Like I wouldn't have a conversation with sixth graders to high school seniors. Like, just know your group well enough to sense when one conversation works for one age group or another. But a couple of the ways I think this really works well is to use a variety of kind of interactive exercises, which I know we're all trying to do in youth ministry. Like, please don't sit down on the couch with all of them and be like, so we're going to talk about sexting. What's your experience? I mean, would you want to have that conversation? No, right? Use the resources, engage in interactive kind of activities around this. And then I often find the kind of third person engagement, right? Like I said, have two people act out a relationship and have the people in the room assess that. That allows people to enter in where they want to into that conversation, to learn from other people who have maybe had that experience when they haven't. So again, the type of activities that one uses are really important. And please don't hesitate to go out and seek out some sexuality educator resources. Those folks are amazing. The organization called Answers at Rutgers has some just great curricula. You bring your faith values to that, right? Ask them to talk about how would you react to this based on this value. Now, most of that is value-based curriculum, but it's not going to speak with a theological voice or a Christian voice. You can add that there. But yes, I would say you got to use actual resources that people have put pedagogical thoughtfulness into to kick off some of these conversations. You can also start with what just recently happened in the media. Quickly, because I know we're almost at time. The faith community I'm part of has a youth ministry that's sort of spiritual but not religious. Over 100 youth show up on a Sunday night, and the youth leaders wanted to have a conversation about gender and gender identity because some negative things were being said about folks who were non-binary or wanted to use different pronouns. We kicked off that conversation by putting media images that were like really popular on TikTok, different sort of TikTok influencers, but then also some, like Harry Styles and stuff like that. Putting some of those images up and just asking them to come up with adjectives that they thought of for each of those images to start the conversation of how we have a gendered response that we've already been culturally conditioned with to kick off the conversation. And so again, just dealing with what they're already swimming in, but getting them to think critically about it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. In the last minute and a half or whatever, suggestions on bringing church leadership on board.
So I think the main conversation that we started out with today, how do we start speaking from both having a broader understanding of sexuality, speaking from a sexual theology and sexual ethic that really is inclusive and is raising kind of the level that we want people to engage in, not just rules-based, but really living out their values and having healthy relationships. I think starting with that conversation gets a lot more people on board. The other piece I think about this is please don't let people think these are just youth issues, right? Everybody's struggling with these issues, especially many of our adults. And so again, resource yourself with some of that information. The book gives you lots of statistics and background information. That alone, I think, also shows that this is an issue everyone needs to be dealing with in our faith communities. And, we're called to help people have healthy relationships. This is an aspect of it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Folks, we are at time. I want to thank Dr. Ott for her time and for her generous sharing with us, some fantastic resources and some great sharing in the chat too. So thank you all for bringing your gifts and your wisdom to this conversation. Please do join us next, the first Wednesday of the month, which will be November 2nd for our next presentation. And thank you all for coming today. Blessings on your ministries.